There's often an impression nowadays that Lincoln's a bit out of the way and a bit off onto the east side of Britain, not one of the most important towns or cities in the country. In the Roman period, the story is completely different. Lincoln is right up there, one of the most important settlements that we have here in Britain, and the material culture that we have left from Lincoln is second to none. Because Lincoln doesn't exist on its own in a bubble. The whole county of Lincolnshire, the agricultural supply that can bring, very, very important to the wealth and the growth of Lincoln as a city and as a centre for economy and for administration of the surrounding region. This is an altar dedication to a god known as Mars Rigonometis. This is a combination of a Roman deity, Mars, the god of war, and a local Celtic deity, Rigonometis. We're not quite sure entirely what Rigonometis would have been worshipped for, but it's evidence of this Roman idea of merging classical deities with local deities. This is one of the civilian tombstones we have from the Colonia. It's for a chap called Flavius Helius. As the tombstone tells us, he was a Greek national. And again, it's this fantastic evidence we have in Lincoln of this multicultural city building up in the Roman period. This is a small section of a Roman milestone that was placed just outside Lincoln on the Fosse Way, the major road running to the southwest, and importantly through Leicester, which is mentioned on this milestone. We often find them in small chunks. Surprisingly, this one has had the description surviving, which is very important. But imagine these things littering the countryside, every Roman mile, which is very similar to a modern mile. So these things have been very, very common sights to people travelling the Roman roads of Lincolnshire. This is a selection of Roman oil lamps that we have in the museum and some very, very nice bronze candlesticks. Obviously, we're talking the days before gas and electric light, quite obviously, so oil lamps are very, very important. Slightly dangerous items, obviously, with a wick protruding out of the hole and a naked flame. House fires must have been very, very common in Roman Lincoln. The candle stands are particularly nice. They're items that I don't think many people would associate with the Romans. They always seem to think of them as being modern inventions, but I think they would have very nicely graced the table of a wealthy Roman family here in Lincoln. It's a very nice piece of stone carving found in Lincoln of a small boy riding a chariot. Something people don't often associate in Britain. When they think of the Romans as the Roman Empire, they think of the gladiatorial games and the chariot racing, and somehow when they think of Britain, that seems to all vanish. But of course, these sports must have been very, very popular in Britain. In Colchester in the last couple of years, there's actually been a Roman chariot racing circuit found. This is evidence this sport must have just been as popular in Lincoln as it was everywhere else in the Roman Empire. The Romans were really the first culture we have in Britain to have throwaway tableware. They have a huge, huge range of material available to most Roman families, starting with fairly basic, locally made ceramic wares, through to the more elaborate imported wares, such as the highly decorated Samian ware. And then for the wealthiest families, copper and bronze items, some of which could be very, very nice. And at the very, very top end of the spectrum, silver and gold tableware, which rivals anything that's ever been made. This is a very important item in the collection. It's made of lead. It's part of a 4th century, so a very late Roman tank, possibly even an early Christian font. These are found in fair quantities. This one's particularly important because of the early Christian symbols on it. The symbol that looks like a P and an X is actually a Christian symbol known as a Cairo, one of the earliest symbols of Christianity, almost to try and hide the Christianity from the more pagan Romans. There's also a very important scene at the top which may depict a very, very early baptism. This is a bronze statuette depicting the goddess Minerva, somebody who's become quite a popular face in Lincoln recently. The university have taken on her face as a logo, a goddess of wisdom but also of war, which gives you some insight into the Roman way of thinking. This particular one was found in Lincoln, and it's very, very high quality, highly sculpted. The person who's made this has certainly had a lot of contact with the continental world, was aware of the high quality sculptural work that was going on the continent, and has reproduced it here in Lincoln. This is a very detailed bronze statuette of the god Mercury, who was one of the protectors of travellers in the Roman world and also a god protecting commerce. And this particular sculpture was found at Brant Bruton to the south of Lincoln, but we know there was a temple to Mercury in the southern walled city of Lincoln, so probably a very important local deity, especially with all the commerce and trade, agriculture going on around Lincoln. This may have been a figure that was very, very important in the religious lives of the local people. This rather cheeky little chappie here is, it looks a bit like a cherubic angel. He's in fact not. It's the head of a fellow called Attis, who was a Middle Eastern deity associated with the worship of the goddess Kibble, who was a prophetess. It's one of the fantastic examples we have in Lincoln of multiculturalism. This idea of Lincoln being a bit of a backwater, not particularly mixing racially. It's completely out of the picture in the Roman period. It's a vibrant city with world cultures mixing quite freely. The people of Lincoln in the Roman period would have been well aware of what was happening across the rest of the world. This little statuette represents one of the lesser-known Roman deities, a figure called Dea Nutrix, who was the goddess of nursing mothers. You can see her here suckling two babies. This would probably have been used as a slightly more superstitious item, probably carried around by a woman in childbirth or had just recently given birth, just to make sure that she stayed safe. People are superstitious today. It was certainly no different in the Roman period. People carried traditions right through from prehistory to ward off evil spirits or to make sure they weren't hedging their bets with fate. This is a part of a Roman tombstone that was found here in Lincoln. It's one of the finest pieces of Roman carving that we have in the museum collection. It depicts a young boy holding a rabbit or a hare. It's possible to interpret this in two ways. One way is just to simply say that it is the tombstone of a young man who had a pet rabbit, had some affinity with hares or rabbits, and is seen holding one here on his tombstone. It is more likely, though, that as the hare had a very strong religious significance with the afterworld in Celtic mythology, even though this is a Roman statuette, it may be a throwback to this young man's heritage as a native Celtic Briton. And this is, in fact, a strong religious message that's being given out rather than just holding a favourite pet. This is a lovely little carving that was found on Hungate in Lincoln, depicting, probably we think, Cupid and Psyche. Cupid and Psyche is one of the classical mythological tales. Again, some of this evidence that Roman mythology, classical mythology, is certainly present here in Lincoln. The story basically is Psyche was a beautiful mortal woman who fell in love with Cupid, eventually betrayed him. All sorts of nasty things happened to her. They do end up happily ever after, though. She is actually turned into a goddess by Cupid. So probably a Roman person looking at this statue, whether it was built into a building or part of a funerary monument, we're not quite sure, but that story must have been brought to life whenever people wandered past and had a look at the sculpture. In reality, as with most Roman sculptures, we see them in this cream natural stone. Of course, it may well have been brightly and realistically painted during its life. So again, we have to take a step of imagination whenever we're looking at stonework like this and realise how much brighter and more beautiful it must have been when it was originally in use. Some of the most common evidence we have of the Roman period is coinage. It's also one of the things people most often associate with Roman life. This is the first mass coinage that appears in Britain, and people still find it and bring it into the museum for identification on a weekly basis. Particularly late Roman small bronze coinage can be found in quite large quantities in most of the fields in Lincolnshire. And it's this cumulative evidence we can build up from looking at the distribution of these coins can start to point to where unknown or previously unknown settlements might be in Lincolnshire. It can be a great clue to piecing together that wider archaeology that we still don't know exists yet. This is one of the better known tombstones we have in Lincoln. It's a military period tombstone of a chap called Gaius Valerius, who was a standard bearer with the 9th Legion. This tombstone was found in 1909 down on South Common. It's one of the bits of evidence we have to suggest there may have been an earlier first Roman fortress to the south of the River Witham and the Brayford Pool before the more northerly fortress was constructed. Standard bearers aren't the most common tombstones to be found, so it's very, very nice to have this example surviving. Gives us lots of personal information about Gaius Valerius himself, the fact that he was the son also of somebody called Gaius. The name of the leader of his century was a chap called Hospice, or Hospies. We know that he lived to be 45, we know that he served for 14 years, so these sorts of tombstones can be fantastic evidence for telling us about life in the Roman army, particularly life in and around very, very early Roman Lincoln.